Texas, 1870. The frontier was a land of promise and of fear. Between the rivers and the endless grass, settlers built fragile homes on ground claimed for centuries by the Apache and the Comanche. Every sunrise could bring trade or death. He was 11 when they came. The sky turned the color of dust, and his mother's voice carried through the wind calling his name. He didn't know it would be the last day he would ever see her face. The Lehmann family were German immigrants farming near Loyal Valley, a quiet outpost on the bleeding edge of the American frontier. That spring, raids swept across the hill country. For the settlers, they were terror. For the tribes, they were survival. To the Apache, led by a young warrior named Chivato, taking the boy was not cruelty. Their own children had been lost, their elders hunted like wolves. Capturing a white child was a way to replace what had been taken, a way to keep their people alive. What began as a raid would become one of the strangest stories in the history of the American frontier, the story of a boy torn from one world and reborn in another. They tied his hands and lifted him onto a horse. As the riders vanished into the plains, he kept looking back until the valley disappeared behind the smoke. He didn't cry. The wind took his tears before they could fall. For 9 years, that boy would live between two worlds and belong to neither. In the years after the Civil War, Texas stretched wide and untamed. The promise of land drew thousands westward, chasing dreams of freedom and fortune. But those same plains had been home to the Apache and the Comanche long before any flag was planted. To the settlers, it was opportunity. To the tribes, it was invasion. The frontier was a wound that refused to heal. The land was wide, and blood often decided who would keep it. Each mile of fence built by a farmer was another line of battle drawn across sacred ground. Wagon tracks carved through hunting trails. Buffalo herds dwindled, and the sound of gunfire replaced the song of the wind. The Lehmann family came from Germany hoping for peace in this new world. They built a small farm near Loyal Valley, a few acres of corn, a wooden barn, and a cabin that stood against the endless sky. Their lives were simple. The boys Herman and Willie helped their father in the fields. Their mother tended the fire and read from the family Bible each night. In their quiet valley, the world still felt safe. But safety on the Texas frontier was an illusion. Beyond the ridges, Apache scouts watched the smoke from settler chimneys. To them, the white man's fences were scars across the land, cutting rivers and trails that had no borders. Chivato, a young Apache warrior, saw the Lehmann homestead from a distance. To his people, the fences around it were not symbols of progress, but of loss. He would later say, "To us, the settlers' fences were wounds across the earth." That spring, the tension broke. One morning, as the sun rose through a veil of dust, riders appeared on the horizon. They came fast and silent, painted for war. The sound of hooves thundered across the field. Dogs barked, chickens scattered, and in seconds, the quiet farm became chaos. Gunshots tore through the air. Herman's father tried to reach for his rifle, but the attack came too quickly. The family screamed. Smoke filled the sky. Willie, the younger brother, ran toward the woods, chased by dust and fear. Herman turned to follow, but hands seized him from behind. A rough voice shouted in a language he didn't understand. He struggled, kicked and clawed, but it was useless. They tied his hands and pulled him onto a horse. The world spun as the riders turned toward the open plains. The cabin grew smaller, the cries of his mother fading with the wind. That night, the smoke from Loyal Valley drifted into the stars. For Herman, the boy who had once known only family and peace, the frontier had shown its true face. They rode through the darkness, and he did not speak. He did not know who these men were or why they had taken him. He only knew that the world he had known was gone. His world ended that night, and another one, wild and unknown, had just begun. They rode through the night without rest, the horses moving like shadows across the plains. Herman's wrists were raw from the rope that bound him, and the dry wind cut through his skin. When dawn came, he saw the land change. The grassy hills of Texas gave way to rough country canyons, rocks, and sand that stretched to the edge of the world. He had never seen a place so empty or so alive. Days passed. He was given little water, no food, and when he stumbled, they whipped the horse forward to drag him along. At night, the Apache camped in silence. They spoke a language that rolled like the wind across stone, sharp and musical. Herman could not understand a word. He only watched the fire and the sparks that rose into the black sky. When they finally reached the mountains of New Mexico, he was half starved and half dreaming. The warriors led him before their chief, a tall man with long braids and calm eyes. His name was Carnoviste, a leader feared by soldiers and settlers alike. The other warriors argued over what to do with the white boy. Some said kill him, others said sell him. But Carnoviste raised his hand. "He is young," he said. "The Great Spirit sends balance. Our sons are gone. This one will live." And so Herman's life was spared. He would not die as an enemy, at least not yet. Chivato later remembered that day. "We called him Enda," he said, the white boy. "Pale as the moon, silent as the wind." In the beginning, Herman hated them. Every time the tribe stopped to rest, he searched for a way to escape. One night, when the guards slept, he ran into the dark hills. The cold air burned his lungs. For hours, he stumbled through the rocks until he found a narrow stream. He drank, collapsed, and dreamed of his mother's face. At sunrise, they found him. The warriors dragged him back into camp. The chief's eyes were cold now. The tribe gathered around. A warrior lifted his knife to the boy's throat, but Carnoviste stopped him. "Not yet," he said. "Let him learn what life means." They tied him to a tree, left him without food, and watched him weaken. For 3 days he hung between life and death. And then, as if something inside him broke, he stopped fighting. When they cut the ropes, he did not run. He stood silently and bowed his head. From that moment, the boy named Herman began to disappear. He learned the Apache words for water, fire, sky, and death. He learned how to cut meat from a deer, how to twist grass into rope, how to ride bareback until his legs trembled. The women taught him to gather roots and herbs. The old men taught him to send not to voices, but to the earth. He saw beauty in things he had once feared. The fire was not an enemy, it was life. The mountains were not walls, they were protection. The people who had taken him began to feel less like captors and more like a world that demanded strength. At night, he sat beside Chivato, who told stories of the spirits and of the old wars. Herman listened silent, memorizing every word. Sometimes Chivato would hand him a piece of dried meat, or show him how to carve an arrow shaft. They spoke little, but in that silence something began to grow, not friendship, but understanding. He no longer prayed to go home. He no longer dreamed of Loyal Valley. The sound of English faded in his mind. In its place came a rhythm of new words, strange but comforting. In his heart, he understood a truth he could never forget. He could die as Herman or live as Enda, and so he lived. The seasons turned. His hair grew long, his skin burned dark. He could track a deer by broken grass, start a fire from dry bark, and ride through storms without fear. When he looked into the water, the boy who once cried for his mother was gone. Only Enda remained. One night by the fire, he stared into the flames and felt their warmth on his face. The light danced in his eyes, flickering between gold and shadow. In that moment, somewhere deep inside, a new life began, the rebirth of a boy who no longer belonged to the world he came from. The years began to pass like the wind that moved across the plains. The boy once known as Herman was gone. In his place stood Enda, no longer a captive, but a part of the tribe. His body grew strong from the hunt, his eyes steady, his tongue fluent in the Apache language. He spoke it as if he had been born to it, each word flowing from his mouth like running water. The people no longer saw him as an outsider. He rode with them, worked beside them, and shared their hunger and laughter. Chivato became his closest companion. Together they rode deep into the canyons, hunting deer and elk, learning every path, every shadow, every sign the wind carried. Chivato showed him how to read tracks in the sand, how to know from a single bent blade of grass which way a man had passed. Onda listened carefully, copying each movement, until he could do the same without thought. They hunted not just for food, but for skill. Every hunt was a lesson. Every mistake could mean death. Onda learned that the warrior's way was not built on anger, but on patience. The Apache fought only when they must. To be a warrior was not simply to kill. It was to live with courage, loyalty, and silence. When the time came for his first raid, Onda was ready. The warriors painted their faces with ash and red clay, their hair tied back, their weapons sharp and silent. Carnoviste led them through the desert before dawn, each man a shadow in the cold blue light. Onda felt the drum of his own heartbeat against his chest. He was not afraid. He remembered the faces of those he had lost, and the hands that had once bound him. He understood now that he fought for the people who had given him life. I fought for those who once terrified me. They struck at a camp of enemy raiders who had stolen Apache horses. The attack was swift and brutal. Arrows hissed through the air, and the world turned to noise and dust. Onda felt the bowstring snap against his fingers. He saw a man charging toward him, shouting in a tongue he did not know. Without thinking, he raised his rifle and fired. The man fell. For a moment, time stopped. The sound of his own breath filled his ears. The smoke hung in the air like a spirit that refused to leave. When it was over, Carnoviste placed a hand on his shoulder. His voice was calm but heavy. "My son has earned his name." That night the tribe held a ceremony by the fire. The drums beat slow and deep, echoing into the night sky. The warriors danced around the flames, each step marking victory and remembrance. Chivato painted Onda's face in black and red, the colors of honor and blood. The tribe sang the songs of their ancestors. Onda stood before the fire, the light flickering across his painted skin. He felt the heat against his chest and the cold air on his back. He was no longer a boy, no longer the frightened child who had looked back toward the Valley of Loyal. He was a warrior of the Apache, bound to their code, their land, and their spirits. He learned to speak little and observe much. In the Apache way, a true warrior did not boast. He kept his heart silent and his actions clean. When the tribe feasted, he served the elders before himself. When they rode into danger, he took the first place in line. His courage was no longer questioned. The rhythm of the drums, the smell of smoke, the stamp of hooves became the rhythm of his life. He rode beside Chivato through storms of dust, the wind tearing through their hair as they crossed the endless plains. Each sunrise painted the desert gold, and Onda felt that he finally belonged to something larger than himself. In those years, he forgot that he had once been a boy from another world. He no longer dreamed of the English words he once spoke or the farm where his mother had called his name. His dreams were of horses, of wind, of the hunt, of the songs that carried through the night. He had found his place among a people who had once taken everything from him, and in their world he had found meaning. The fire, the dust, and the sound of hooves had shaped him. The captive had become the warrior. And as the dawn rose again over the desert, the drums faded into the wind, and the boy who had been stolen from his home stood tall among those who now called him brother. The years of quiet life in the mountains could not last forever. Rumors began to spread through the Apache camps. The soldiers were coming. Columns of U.S. cavalry rode deeper into the frontier, armed with new rifles and orders to destroy every village that refused to surrender. Smoke rose on the horizon where other bands had been burned out. The world that had shaped Onda was beginning to die. The raids that once brought food and horses now brought disaster. Soldiers struck without warning, burning homes and killing the old and the weak. Each week, more Apache bands fled south or were forced into reservations. Carnoviste tried to hold his people together, moving constantly through the mountains, avoiding every trail that smelled of the army. But the circle was closing. One morning, the soldiers found them. The first sign was the sound of gunfire echoing through the canyon. Women screamed, children ran for the river, and the air filled with dust and smoke. Onda grabbed his rifle and fired back until his hands bled. Horses reared and fell. Bullets shattered the rocks around him. When the fight was over, the camp was silent. Carnoviste had been hit while trying to lead the women to safety. Onda found him lying beneath a cedar tree, his chest still, his eyes already turning to glass. The boy who had once been his captive knelt beside him, calling his name in a voice the mountains swallowed. Chivato later said, "We buried him with the songs of our fathers." The boy cried like one of us. After the burial, Onda sat by the fire alone. The wind howled through the broken camp. Every face he had loved was gone or scattered. The man who had saved him, who had called him son, was dead. In that emptiness, something inside him hardened. Grief turned to anger, and anger to rage. He joined a small band of young warriors who refused to surrender. They rode out under the moon, silent as shadows, their hearts full of loss. For Nda, it was no longer about land or tribe. It was about revenge. They struck at isolated cabins and wagon trains. He did not know who the settlers were, nor did he care. To him, they were the same men who had killed his father, burned his home, and hunted his people. He moved like a ghost through the plains, his face painted black, his eyes empty. One night they attacked a ranch along a river. The gunfire was quick and brutal. When the fight ended, Onda stepped into the light of the burning house. A man lay at his feet, a white man, his eyes open to the flames. For a moment, the warrior stood frozen. The man's face was rough and weathered, not unlike the farmers of Loyal Valley. The smell of smoke brought back a memory he thought he had buried forever, a woman's voice calling his name, the sound of fences creaking in the wind. He realized then that he had become what he once feared. He had killed one of his own kind. For a long time he stood there, staring at the body, the flames reflected in his eyes. The wind carried the cries of horses and the crackle of fire, but he did not move. The border between who he was and what he had become had vanished. When dawn came, the survivors of the band told him of another people to the north, the Comanche, who still fought against the army under a leader named Quanah Parker. Onda left without a word. The Comanche welcomed him. They saw in him a fighter, a man with no past and no tribe. To them, he was neither Apache nor white. He was something in between, a spirit made from war and loss. They called him the ghost between tribes. He rode with them through the plains following the last battles of the free people of the West. But inside he was already lost. The faces of the dead followed him wherever he went. At night, he sat before the fire and stared into the flames. The light flickered across his painted skin, the shadows of two worlds meeting on his face. Around him, the camp slept. Above him, the stars burned cold and distant. Nda did not speak. He had no prayers left, no language that could hold his sorrow. The boy from Loyal Valley and the warrior of the Apache had become one and the same. He sat there until the fire turned to embers, a ghost between two worlds, waiting for the wind to carry him wherever it pleased. In 1878, after nearly a decade of wandering between tribes, war bands, and empty plains, Onda's path crossed the soldiers once again. It happened on a cold morning after a small skirmish near the Red River. The fighting had ended quickly. Smoke drifted across the field, and among the captured stood a man with dark skin, long braids, and eyes that burned with something the soldiers could not name. When they pulled the paint from his face, the truth startled them. Beneath the dust and scars, his skin was pale. They asked him his name. He said nothing. They asked what tribe he came from, and he looked away. One officer studying him closer realized the man spoke a few broken words of English. News traveled fast. Word spread that a white man raised by Indians had been taken alive. Within weeks, a message reached the settlers of Loyal Valley. There was a woman there who had never stopped waiting. She was older now, her hair gray, her eyes tired from years of searching the horizon. When she heard the story, she saddled a horse and rode to the fort. She could hardly believe that her son, the boy taken 9 years ago, might still be alive. When they brought him to her, the camp fell silent. He stood before her in worn buckskins, his hair long, a necklace of bone around his throat. She stepped closer, her hands trembling. For a moment she hesitated, as if she feared the man in front of her was only a dream. Then she touched his face and the years between them broke. She spoke, but he no longer knew the language. They embraced, but the embrace was wordless. To her, he was still the little boy who used to chase fireflies behind the house. To him, she was a stranger from a life that no longer felt real. The soldiers watching nearby wiped their eyes. They saw reunion. He felt confusion. When they returned to Loyal Valley, the townspeople came to see him, curious about the wild man. Children hid behind their mothers, whispering. Men watched him from a distance. He moved through the village in silence, wearing the same clothes he had worn among the Apache. When they spoke to him, he answered in short, careful phrases. The language of his childhood came back only in fragments. He tried to live as they did. He worked the fields, ate at the table, and slept in a bed again. But everything felt wrong. The sound of church bells made him restless. The smell of soap and wood floors reminded him of confinement. The night sky seemed too still without drums, without the voices of the people who had once been his family. At times he walked out to the edge of the valley, where the grass met the sky. There he would sit alone, watching the wind move through the fields, whispering in a tongue no one else could understand. He wrote later, "When I came home, I was a stranger to both races. Among his own people, he was feared and pitied. Among the Apache and Comanche, he was remembered as a brother who had vanished into the white world. Between them, he stood alone. The soldiers and settlers told stories about his bravery, about how he had survived 9 years among the Indians. But no one asked what it had cost him. No one asked what it meant to lose one home to gain another. He had left the frontier behind, but the frontier had not left him. It lived in his silence, in the way he turned his face toward the wind, as if listening for voices that only he could hear. The years passed, and the world around him changed. The wild frontier that had shaped his life was gone. Railroads crossed the plains, towns rose where camps once stood, and the sound of drums was replaced by the whistle of steam. Herman Lehmann, the boy once called Unda, grew old quietly in Loyal Valley. He lived in a small house on the edge of town, close enough to hear the church bells, far enough to see the open hills that reminded him of the life he had left behind. People who met him said he was polite, quiet, and a little distant, as if his mind was always somewhere else. He dressed like no one else in town. A wide cowboy hat shaded his weathered face, but around his neck hung beads he had kept from his years among the Apache. He wore boots scuffed by years of walking the same path between his garden and the prairie. When the children of the valley saw him, they whispered stories about the man who had once lived with the Indians, the man who spoke to the wind. He rarely spoke about the past, but when he did, his voice carried the rhythm of 2 worlds. He told of Carnoviste and Chivato, of the hunts, the ceremonies, and the life that had shaped him more than any school or church ever could. He spoke of how the Apache saw the land as sacred, how every river and mountain had a spirit. Some people listened with fascination. Others looked away uncomfortable with what they did not understand. In 1927, near the end of his life, Herman finally decided to tell his story in full. He wrote a book called 9 Years Among the Indians, a record of everything he had seen and learned. He wanted the world to remember that the people who had once been called savages had hearts and laws, songs and stories just as deep as any other. In his words, he tried to preserve the language of a people who had taught him how to live. Not long before he died, he reunited with an old friend from his warrior years, Quanah Parker, the great Comanche chief, who had also lived between two worlds. The two men sat together on the porch of Herman's house, gray-haired and silent for a long time. When they finally spoke, they talked of the past, of battles and peace, of families lost and found. Both men knew what it meant to walk both roads, to belong everywhere and nowhere. He was not white. He was not Apache. He was the bridge proof that humanity lives on both sides. In his final years, Herman spent most evenings outside watching the sun fall over the Texas hills. The light turned the grass to gold, and the wind carried faint whispers of a language long gone. Sometimes he would close his eyes and hear the drums again, the laughter of a people who had once called him brother. When he died in 1932, he was buried in Loyal Valley beneath the wide Texas sky he had never stopped loving. His grave was marked with a simple stone bearing both his names, Herman Lehmann and Nda. If you stand there today, you can still hear the wind move through the grass. Somewhere between the sigh of the prairie and the sound of the horizon, his story lives on the story of a boy who became a bridge between two worlds. More than a century has passed since Herman Lehmann's time, yet his story still echoes across the plains. The land that once divided settlers and tribes now carries the quiet traces of both. The fences remain, the towns have grown, but the wind that moves through Texas is the same wind that carried the cries of that 11-year-old boy into another world. Today, historians and descendants of the Apache and Comanche remember him not as a captive, but as a symbol of survival. His life stands as proof that identity is not fixed by birth or blood. It is shaped by experience, by loss, and by the courage to understand both sides of a broken history. Across classrooms and museums, people speak his name with new meaning. They see in him the story of cultural resilience, of a bridge built not from politics or conquest, but from empathy. He was a man who crossed the borders of language, tribe, and faith, and found humanity on every side. History is not made of sides, it is made of stories. And Herman's story reminds us that even in war, love and belonging can cross any border. Under the wide Texas sky, his memory endures in the wind, in the grass, and in the silence between two worlds that once seemed forever apart.